Macklemore?
What, what?
Yeah, that guy. So for those of you who weren't there, 2012's The Heist by Macklemore and Ryan Lewis was the biggest album going. Or more accurately, I thought it was the biggest album going because the university I attended, we were gonna have Macklemore come and perform for us before he got big. This was right before The Heist dropped. Everyone at my school was really excited for Macklemore to come. And then The Heist happened and he canceled and he did not come to our school. The people I was around, the people who listen to music, because I've never been like on the cutting edge or anything, they were all listening to Macklemore. And so I kind of got on board. I thought it was huge. I thought The Heist was the biggest album. Turns out it wasn't, but Thrift Shop and Can't Hold Us were in the top 10 of 2013. So it was big. It was a big thing. But the point being here, I was listening to Macklemore and I was really excited about his first album, separate from Ryan Lewis, that came out in 2017. And there was this first single, Glorious.
I feel glorious.
The name of the song, it was good. But the song is glorious. But then I heard this line.
I heard you die twice. Once when they bury you in the grave, and the second time is the last time that somebody mentions your name.
And believe you me, I about screamed when I heard it. Because here was Macklemore referencing the angst of epic heroes everywhere. The idea that they need a name that endures for the benefit of a better afterlife or for even achieving immortality. Macklemore is expressing the entire plot of the Epic of Gilgamesh and the totality of Gilgamesh's angst. For what can man take with him to the grave but a name that endures? So who wrote the Epic of Gilgamesh? No one. Everyone? Much in the Homeric tradition, Gilgamesh was probably an oral tale that was much later written down, and it was probably just passed around by word of mouth. The opening line of "I will proclaim" is really indicative that this was something that was told orally and that people would memorize the entirety of the tale. Or in the Sumerian, there were probably 6 or 7 main tales, and you would just have those in your head. So a big indicative of oral storytelling, and you would see this in the Odyssey or the Iliad as well, is the heroes kind of have epitaphs that are attached to their names. And then when a hero is going out and doing whatever they're doing, they might explain what they're doing multiple times to multiple people, or the way they're described may happen multiple times. They may do something kind of in a pattern several times. And that's kind of a trick of the storyteller. It gives them the ability to, while they're saying this part that they know and that they've said a couple times now, it gives them time to think ahead about the next part of the poem. Like there are all these kind of like little triggers of I say this word and this next part kind of comes to me naturally. So Gilgamesh is filled with these kind of hints and tricks of oral tradition that we know of. In that same kind of vein of the oral tradition, his exploits are going to vary from teller to teller and from culture to culture. So the version of Gilgamesh that we get from the Sumerians is a little different from the version of Gilgamesh that we get from the Akkadians versus the Old Babylonian to the kind of more standard Babylonian that we get later. And isn't that a lot to go over all the different versions of Gilgamesh that we have access to? But his general wants and desires do more or less fill kind of this basic archetypal role of the epic hero. So what we have of Gilgamesh now, the kind of the main accepted version, the tablets that we have the best access to, are the Old Babylonian tablets. They're going to be in translations like this one or this one. So this is the 1960s translation, and then this is kind of the more updated 2010s translation. And they have a lot of similarities, they have some differences. This has a lot more to it because a lot more of the clay tablets have been found. But we'll get into that. But first, before we do that, what is an epic? So for starters, it is a protagonist of unbelievable stature or wit. In the case of Gilgamesh, he was about 17 feet tall, pretty big. But an epic hero can be epic in more ways than just being really tall. They tend to either be like really beautiful or really strong or invincible or clever. So that's kind of like the Odysseus versus Achilles standpoint. So Odysseus is really witty. Achilles is impervious except for his heel. An epic hero is setting out to complete a task that no ordinary man can. They have superhuman strength and bravery. They meet with challenges that are outside the realm of normal, of what someone actually would meet. So it's going to kind of contend with the fantastical. Our hero is going to travel beyond the realm of the geographical area that he is from. He is going to confront what would lay beyond there, what people would be afraid of being beyond there. So that would be the greater chaotic cosmos. He may traverse to the land of the dead, something that Enkidu and Odysseus both do. He might go over oceans, travel great distances, fight really scary monsters that we wouldn't meet in the land of order, which is the known world. Generally speaking, the epic hero leaves the realm of order into the realm of chaos, and he meets with monsters, gods, and trials. So this specific epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is found in Mesopotamia in 1840, when archaeologists found clay tablets in a ruined library in the city of Nineveh. While there are surviving poems from the Sumerians that are dated around 2300, the Epic of Gilgamesh as we know it was compiled or edited in Akkadian sometime between 1600 and 1200 BCE by a Babylonian scribe named Senleki Unini. What a name. And I'm going to caveat here, I'm going to do my best with pronunciations, but I don't have that much background in Akkadian, so we're going to get what we're going to get here. So also we need to distinguish between a few things before we totally jump into the plot of Gilgamesh. So Sumerian is going to reference the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates River in southern Iraq that bumps up against the Persian Gulf. That is going to be the location of the Gilgamesh myth. The Sumerians have their own distinct pantheon of gods. This area was conquered by the Akkadians in 2350, and the pantheon of gods was combined. So a lot of the names that are going to be in here are not the original Sumerian names. Some of them are the Babylonian names instead of the Akkadian names. Inanna is going to be Ishtar, which is kind of more the Babylonian goddess. The epic itself is taking place in Uruk before the Akkadian invasion. The 5 poems from the Sumerians that involve Gilgamesh, we do have access to, but not all of them appear in the kind of compiled overall story that is the Epic of Gilgamesh. So some things get left out. So we've got this Babylonian scribe who's kind of editing and trying to create a narrative story that makes sense. And that's why some things got left on the proverbial cutting floor, chiseled away, if you will, from the clay tablets. So the mix of Sumerian and Akkadian gets further exasperated by the Babylonian of it all, and we are still deciphering parts of the Sumerian and Akkadian. We just have fewer copies of that. So that's why the standard Babylonian version of the tale is what has gotten to be really well known. So there's no pure and perfect version of Gilgamesh, and that's kind of the wonderful thing about it. And as more and more clay tablets are found, and probably a lot of them are going to be broken or worn away or damaged, we're trying just to translate what can be translated and compile into this overarching canon and filling in lines here or there. A tablet may have access to lines that maybe were destroyed in another tablet, and we're able to kind of combine them all together and have a good idea of what this story is. This is still a really incomplete masterpiece, but we don't have access to a really large number of the Gilgamesh epic. It's amazing what is here. Maybe one day it really will be complete if we continue to find these clay tablets. And a note on clay tablets, I'm kind of retconning myself here. Clay tablets don't decompose, they break. It is a pain in the bottom to reconstruct all these clay tablets and to try and figure out what pieces go where. They might be worn away by the sands of time. There might be like worms who have burrowed through them. They can be really heavily damaged. So it's not like a papyrus where it just like crumbles to dust when it gets too humid. A clay tablet, there's not a lot that's going to destroy it in the ground. But whether or not it actually will be useful ultimately to archaeologists and scholars, kind of, it's hit or miss. There are lines missing. when you read it, they really annotate where the lines are missing. Some of it's kind of like their best guess of what would go there. They are archaeologists who, by gosh, they are doing their best to tell us a really complete story. And it's a beautiful story. So let's jump into it with the characters. Let's start there. Who are the characters in the Epic of Gilgamesh? So first we're going to have Gilgamesh himself. In the prologue, he is described as having a perfect body. He has beauty and courage from the gods and is terrifying, like a wild bull. And that fits with his kind of divine mother, Ninsun, who is a goddess, and she is described as the wild cow. How complimentary. And then Gilgamesh is 2/3 God, 1/3 man. How this math is mathing, I'm not sure, but that's what the epic goes with. So he is a demigod, but he is still mortal. And he will die. Before the epic starts, Gilgamesh is already the king of the city of Uruk and has built its strong, tall walls in a temple called Ianu for Anu and Ishtar, Inanna and the Sumerian. So he's built this grand temple in the middle of Uruk, he's built the walls, and the gods should be happy with him. So despite building the walls and the temples, Gilgamesh is not considered to be a good king. He exploits men, potentially in warfare, potentially just exhausting them in his building projects, but he's not being a good shepherd to them. And he is sexually exploiting the women of the city. And he's kind of like taking the first night from newlyweds, so it's kind of like called the king's right, the king's night, where instead of a woman sleeping with her husband the first night that they're married, the king comes in and says, "You're gonna sleep with me instead." And it's kind of supposed to be an honor, but even in this day and age, it is not considered an honor. People are pretty upset about it, so they're crying out to the gods that something has to be done to stop Gilgamesh from being a menace. They're not thinking they can get rid of the king. They're thinking they need a way for the gods to intervene to reform him into a good shepherd, one that is fulfilling the proper responsibilities of guidance and building and leading his army and kind of taking the concerns of the people in consideration. And so the gods make Enkidu. Enkidu is made out of clay, and he is kind of just like plopped into the wilderness by the gods. He is described as a wild man with long hair like a woman's, and he is covered in matted body hair. He lives in the forest and is created to be an equal partner with Gilgamesh. He is also mortal. He's not even a demigod. He is, though, physically slightly shorter than Gilgamesh, but he is broader in body, so they're both enormous. We should assume that Enkidu is like 15 feet or something. Like, he's still huge. That's kind of the main humans of our story that matter, and the next are going to be the gods. And that's what's so fascinating though about Gilgamesh, is just how much he is interacting with the divine. First, we're gonna have the god Anu. He is the god of the firmament. Let's take a minute and talk about the firmament. So, you know, in Genesis, when God separates the waters, so you have the top water and the lower water, and there's land in the middle. This upper water is the sky, and there's this perception that the firmament up here is water. So it's like the ocean above. And the god's job was to prevent the ocean above from coming down and flooding everything. So that's kind of what rain is. And when you have these like flood myths that are in Egypt, in Babylonian mythology and Sumerian mythology here, in the Christian Bible and Jewish Bible, the reason for that is because there's a real belief that up above you are the chaos waters, and God, or a god, is preventing that from flooding you, or has flooded you in the past and is just like holding back now. He could do it again. So that's what Anu is the lead god of. He's one of the first gods. He's kind of one of the fathers of all of them. The next goddess is Ishtar, or Inanna, who is the goddess of love and war. And she's really depicted as kind of a capricious, and the right word for it. So she's up to no good, I guess would be the way to put it. She kind of seems to be really led by her passions. It's not that she goes to war kind of in this clear-headed state. So it's a very passionate war, that is Ishtar, or Inanna. Next is Shamash, who is the sun god, and he's kind of Gilgamesh's patron god too. So whenever Gilgamesh gets in trouble, Shamash is there to get him out of it. Enlil is the king of the gods, and he's the god of the air. So he's kind of like a Zeus equivalent. In myth, Enlil has very little sympathy for humans in the original flood story. So he's the one who calls on the destruction of humankind. And like the flood myth appears in several different forms. So the larger version one can find in something like this, and it is called, it's a different name in that one. It is called Atrahasis. And that character who is the king who escapes the flood is in Gilgamesh as Utnapishtim. And he is this like human who escapes from the flood and gets immortal life. So that flood myth is in Gilgamesh, but that's probably added by the Babylonian scribe from a separate myth. So it's kind of combining things together into one mega myth, an epic, if you will. So Enlil tries to get rid of the humans like 4 or 5 times, and the 5th try is the flood, and humans are saved by the god Enki or Ea, and he is the god of wisdom and magic. Enki helps to create the humans from clay with the mother goddess, and Enki uses his like crafty nature to warn humans of coming disasters. Why he's so kind-hearted and good to the humans, who's to say? But he's there being good. And then Lagalbanda is Gilgamesh's father, who does not have a speaking role in this, but he is mentioned a few times, and he is a mortal king who ended up becoming deified by the Sumerians and is Gilgamesh's patron god in this myth, and he is in a lot of like the Sumerian kings list. So presumably he and Gilgamesh are real people, maybe? Who's to say? There are more mentioned gods, but these are kind of the ones with speaking roles who probably are the most important to the immediate plot. And then for any other humans, there's like Utnapishtim, there is the harlot that Enkidu sleeps with that brings him into humanity. Like there are some people floating around, but we'll get to them as we go through the plot. And with the plot, I'm hoping to kind of add context as we go. If you would like more on Sumeria in general, I already did that video if you'd like to go watch it, which is the history of Sumer from 4000 to 2000 BC. So anyway, the plot of Gilgamesh. Okay, so opening scene. Gilgamesh takes all the sons of Uruk to war, or uses them for hard labor, and he's sleeping with all of the daughters. He doesn't act as a good king should and shepherd his people. The people of Uruk cry out to the gods for some sort of solution to their Gilgamesh problem, and the gods create Enkidu. He's made of clay, like the very first men, and he is described as having very like similar features to the goddess of corn or wheat. Her name is Ninsaba, and to the god of cattle, Semuquan. Both are gods of domestic products, but Enkidu is anything but domestic at all. He is wild, and he will need to be domesticated if he is to fulfill his purpose of becoming a partner to Gilgamesh. Enkidu is just kind of like running wild in the forest, doing whatever he feels, and this shepherd hunter fella sights him, and he's getting annoyed with Enkidu because Enkidu is letting go all of his animals out of traps. So he's like, something's got to be done about Enkidu, and he tells his dad about it, and his dad's like, you've got to send away to the city and get a harlot out here. And that's the word they're using in this translation. I'm pretty sure this is something along the lines of a temple prostitute. She needs to come out here and have sex with him, and then the animals won't want anything to do with him. So that is what they do. The hunter trapper guy goes to Uruk and he meets with Gilgamesh and he tells him about Enkidu, and he is given this harlot, temple prostitute, named Shamhat. The shepherd trapper guy brings her to the wilderness where Enkidu is, and they're hanging out by this watering hole, and Enkidu shows up and he's like, okay, now's your time. And he leaves and she gets naked, and Enkidu's like, all right, I guess we're having sex now. And they have sex for a week straight in the myth. No breaks, just sex. So after Enkidu sleeps with her, with Shamhat, his quickness is gone. He has grown weak, for wisdom was in him, and the thoughts of man were in his heart. And Shamhat tells him not to be distressed because now he is kind of like a god. He has obtained wisdom through the carnal act. So she convinces him he needs to go to Uruk and meet Gilgamesh, and Enkidu agrees, and the two sleep together for another week. Enkidu longs for a comrade, and the woman is like not enough to satisfy him because he is someone who is technically beyond humanity. Gilgamesh and Enkidu are not made of the same stuff as normal humans. that gods specifically make a king type human that is supposed to shepherd over the people, and they are made of that. So they don't really have any companions to relate to them fully. They are only going to have each other. That's why they become such close friends. Gilgamesh is back in Uruk, and he has a dream about Enkidu. Enkidu is gonna give him strength, and that he will love him as a woman. And I don't necessarily think that this is meant to be romantic love, but more to say that their relationship with each other is going to be the deepest and most intimate relationship of their life. The only sexually explicit relationships that are described in the Epic of Gilgamesh are heterosexual. So that's between Enkidu and Shamhat, and then Gilgamesh with the women of Uruk. Within the text, those are the only explicit acts. But Enkidu and Gilgamesh do have a very deep emotional relationship. They are described as loving each other as one would love a wife. I'm pretty sure at a guess that this is kind of more of a euphemism for the depth of their relationship. They're as close as brothers, but in some versions of this story, and especially in the Sumerian version, Enkidu does seem kind of a lot more like a servant to Gilgamesh. He's not necessarily as bright, and he kind of makes bad choices and is kind of more like the comic relief almost. He's not as smart, but in the Babylonian, he's kind of given more intelligence and moral vigor, I would say. So he's less subservient as the myths go on. Enkidu is hanging out with the shepherds and trappers instead of going directly to Uruk, and he's acting kind of the way a good king would act. He is protecting them. He's killing the wolves and the lions that are aiming to go after the sheep. And he seems kind of like he's kind of content maybe just to stay and be doing that. He has been domesticated. He has consumed bread and wine, and his matted body hair, I guess, has been taken care of. He now looks like a divine man. He is huge, and he is doing his job as a protector. He sees some guys from Uruk, and he sends her to go investigate what's going on, and it turns out that there's this big wedding that's going to be happening in Uruk. But guess what? Gilgamesh is planning to sleep with the bride, and this enrages Enkidu, and he's like, this will not stand. I'm going to go confront Gilgamesh about that. So he gets to Uruk, and the wedding happens, and he physically steps in front of Gilgamesh and blocks his way from going to be with the bride. And the two are gonna fight and grapple, and they're locked together. And a lot of this fight is missing from the translation. We don't have it. But eventually Gilgamesh proves that he is the stronger of the two, and Enkidu gets thrown. And the two ultimately embrace, and Enkidu's like, there's no one like you in the world, Gilgamesh, you're the strongest man ever. And they're best friends now. And that's it. And then not too much is said actually of Gilgamesh as a king and a leader till the end. So I guess we're supposed to kind of assume, or maybe it's in the parts that are lost, that Gilgamesh is now a better king because he has met Enkidu. So that's chapter 1. That's the first tale in the Epic of Gilgamesh. There are, I'm gonna get this right. There are 11 tablets, but in this version, and I kind of like the way this one kind of chunks it up, there are 7 stories. So the first one is the coming of Enkidu, and then the next one is called the Forest Journey. That is kind of the other big Enkidu, there are 3 kind of big Enkidu stories, and this is the second one, and this is going to be the one where Gilgamesh and Enkidu go off to fight Humbaba the ogre. We'll get to that now. Enkidu is given a dream from Enlil about Gilgamesh, and it's that Gilgamesh is going to die, that his reign isn't going to go on forever. Gilgamesh has a fear of death. I don't think it's as pronounced as it's going to be. And in this version, Enkidu actually kind of seems upset about something, and to cheer him up, Gilgamesh is saying, we need to go and fight Humbaba, and that's going to cheer you up, Enkidu. Humbaba is this ogre and or miasmic darkness, but we're going to go with ogre, who guards the cedars of Lebanon for Enlil. And the cedars of Lebanon are very, very important to the ancient world. They're important both to the Mesopotamians and to the Egyptians and to the Akkadians and the Assyrians ultimately. They are the best wood in the Near East. There's not a lot of wood there. So there would be regular trips out to go conquer in Lebanon so that you could get a bunch of wood and bring it back for your temples or monuments or whatever else you need to use wood for. It's very expensive. So the point of this quest is to go defeat the monster that's in Lebanon and to take a bunch of cedar and bring it back to Uruk. And everyone says, this is impossible, Gilgamesh, you can't go fight Humbaba. And Enkidu is like, we can't go fight Humbaba. There's no way we can win against Humbaba. And Gilgamesh, and this is why I say I don't think he has a very pronounced fear of death yet. He is kind of like, if we die fighting Humbaba, we die fighting Humbaba. At least it's a really honorable death. Gilgamesh, though, is desiring in all of this, is that he wants a name that will endure, which is kind of a form of immortality. Let's talk about the Mesopotamian view of the afterlife. Remember that Macklemore song?
I heard you die twice. Once when they bury you in the grave, and the second time is the last time that somebody mentions your name.
So where he's saying, I hear you die twice. And this is a huge part of Near Eastern culture. This is something that persists with the Egyptians and with the Mesopotamians. And it's this idea that when you die, and this is more Mesopotamian than Egyptian as I talk about this, when you die, you're going to go to this place called Kher. And it's horrible. The food tastes bad, it's clay, it's ash. You are clothed in just these bird feathers and it's always dark. And the only way anything good about your afterlife happens is if people remember your name and speak your name and maybe even leave you offerings on earth. But otherwise, you've got a pretty miserable existence happening here in the afterlife. So if you want immortality, then the only way you're going to get it is if people know your name. And that's why Gilgamesh really focuses in on this. I need my name to endure. I need people to know my name. They need to say, Gilgamesh did this, Gilgamesh did that. But I digress. So Gilgamesh wants to go make a name for himself and or cheer Enkidu up. They need to go fight Humbaba. The forest is described as 10,000 leagues away, or about 300 miles. That is not accurate. If you kind of look at the map of it now and measure it out, it's at minimum 500, probably 600 miles that Gilgamesh would be traveling. So he's pushing for this great quest, and Enkidu doesn't want to go. And he's kind of, I think, functioning as a sort of hype man for Gilgamesh. So Enkidu is almost as big as Gilgamesh and only slightly less strong. So if he's afraid of Humbaba and then they go and defeat him, then it shows just how big and bad Gilgamesh is. The men of his city say don't go, his mother says don't go, but eventually he's getting everyone on board. Enkidu and the men of Uruk and his mother Ninsun and the god Shamash, they all are warning against his quest, but before he leaves, they've all blessed off on the mission. And they set out walking the huge distance to Lebanon. I love this. They complete 40 days of walking in 3 days. And this is very classic Bible language or Near Eastern language. So 40 is kind of code for a really long time. So whenever you see 40 popping up, 40 days or 40 years, it's not necessarily trying to say 40. It just means it was a long time. And then 3 is a number that's kind of something meant to be complete. So trinities are really common, 3 days being how long something takes. It's a complete number, it's a good number. They like that number. Same with 7. He completed something that was supposed to take a really long time in a much shorter time that was a good complete number, is how you should take this. So they walk what should take a month and a half in about 3 days. On their way to the mountain of the gods, whenever they stop, Gilgamesh has dreams, and they set up kind of this special altar so that Gilgamesh can have the dreams. And each time Gilgamesh kind of wakes up and he's like, I'm really terrified from this dream that I have. And Enkidu's like, no, it's a positive sign. The gods have blessed off on this. We're going to be able to defeat Humbaba, no problemo. And this next bit is where I think the translations have kind of changed over 50 years. So this is the difference between the 1960 and the 2010s. In the 1960s, let's start with this version. To enrage Humbaba, Gilgamesh cuts down a cedar. Humbaba hears the cedar fall and then starts to let out some of his radiating power. Humbaba has these things called the 7 splendors. It's not totally clear what they are, but they can radiate out and they cause great pain, or they cause someone just to fall over dead. It can be understood as glory or splendors or light or just something, a consuming fire maybe even. They keep felling the cedars, and as they are knocking the cedars down, they eventually are able to reach the lair of Humbaba. So I guess knocking the cedars down maybe weakens the splendors. And once there, Humbaba tries to negotiate with Gilgamesh that if Gilgamesh will let him live, Humbaba will become his servant. And Enkidu is warning against this plan. And Humbaba kind of tries to pull a Gollum between Sam and Frodo here.
Crumbs on his jacket says, "He took it."
He's like, oh, Enkidu is just trying to trick you. He's just jealous of you, Gilgamesh. But Gilgamesh doesn't fall for it. So they execute Humbaba, and the ogre is dead. They execute Humbaba. And then Enkidu proceeds to clear out all of the cedars from where they are to the Euphrates, which presumably is just a whole lot of wood. And then the god Enlil, who is the one who set Humbaba there to guard the cedars, because they're the cedars of the gods, places a curse upon them, that from henceforth there will be fire in your faces, may it eat the bread that you want to eat, and may it drink your drink. And fire would be like a metaphor for destruction, and that kind of is like why they're taking the wood, presumably, because you need fire to bake bricks and to make these baked clay bricks that are really useful for building things. And then to eat their bread would be kind of like to hope that what they create is ultimately destroyed. In the Andrew George translation, Gilgamesh and Enkidu kind of admire the mountain from a distance, and then Gilgamesh is just petrified with awe, and maybe he's even actually afraid. So in this version of the epic, Gilgamesh doesn't really show too much fear until right about here. So this is where he's confronting something beyond the normal for the first time. Before, he's always just fought with men. This is him fighting a monster. Humbaba is very clearly an ogre in this one, and he's kind of on the outskirts of the cedars, and he only has one of his splendors on. He doesn't have the other 6. So Shamash tells Gilgamesh and Enkidu they need to go kill him now if they're going to kill him, because if he has access to his splendors, they won't be able to do it. So they go in and they have the big fight, and they kind of subdue him. And then once again, Humbaba makes the plea. He says, I'll be your servant if you spare him. But Enkidu says, if you let him go into that forest, he's going to put on his splendors and he's going to kill us. A fair assumption, Enkidu. And Humbaba, instead of kind of trying to play them off each other, he appeals to Enkidu. He's like, Enkidu, I knew you in the wild. I left you alone. We were cool, man. Why are you letting him kill me? And he does this 3 times. Remember, 3 is a complete number. And they eventually move past it. And Enkidu's like, before the gods find out that we're here, we need to wrap this up. You need to kill Humbaba so we can get our wood and go. They do, they kill Humbaba, and then they cut all the wood that they want, and they float it down the Euphrates, and it heads back to Uruk. There does not appear to be any kind of curse on Gilgamesh or Enkidu in this version of the tale. So that is the journey to the forest. And next, we're going to talk about the third kind of big story, which is Ishtar and Gilgamesh, and then the death of Enkidu. This is the version of Gilgamesh that I think is funny. It's probably my favorite myth. Gilgamesh and Enkidu have gotten back from fighting Humbaba, and Gilgamesh looks a mess. He's got to go clean up. So he gets all cleaned up. He's brushed out his hair. He's got his royal robe on. He's looking fit, fly, whatever the word is now. I don't know it. What the youths would call him.
How do you do, fellow kids?
But he looks great. Ishtar takes a gander at old Gilgamesh, and she's like, I want your seed for my body. In this translation, in the 1960s. This one just goes with, I would like you to be my consort. And you might be thinking, oh yeah, Gilgamesh, go for it. Go be with Ishtar. That sounds great. Who wouldn't want to be with Ishtar? And Gilgamesh is like, no, I will not be with you, Ishtar, because you are horrible. He just does this list, this very impressive list of all the ways that Ishtar has messed up her love life, and it's brutal. He references pretty much my favorite Ishtar myth, which is that she loved a man named Tammuz and marries him. And sometimes he's immortal, sometimes he's the god of agriculture. The agriculture one kind of makes the most sense. So Ishtar becomes jealous of him because everyone's really charmed by him, everyone loves him, so she kills him, of course. But then once she kills him, she super regrets it. So she has to descend down to the underworld because the earth has dried up, everything's horrible, people are dying.
There's people that are dying.
Ishtar descends to the underworld and she is like begging for Tammuz to be released. And the goddess of death, Ereshkigal, agrees, but only for 6 months out of the year. So think of it as kind of like a reverse Hades Persephone. It's like gender swapped, but it's kind of the same why the seasons happen type of myth. But also what Ishtar has done that Gilgamesh throws into her face is that she once loved a shepherd and then she turned him into a wolf. She loved a stallion, but decreed that he was going to get like the whip and the spurs. And then she loved the lion, but condemned it to being like in the lion pit all the time. She loved a man called Ishulanu, and she turned him into a mole rat, blind mole of some kind. She turned him into a mole. Gilgamesh's point here is if you did all these terrible things to the people that you claim to love, and now you're claiming that you want to be with me, pretty much I can guarantee that you're going to do something horrible to me in the end. And Ishtar is enraged. So she goes to her father Enlil and she asks for the bull of heaven, also known as Taurus, to be released so she can set it on Uruk to get revenge on Gilgamesh. And she is told that the cost for the bull's release is going to be 7 years of drought for Uruk, or the bull in some translations just is going to destroy the granary that has 7 years of grain maybe stored away. But Ishtar says, this is no problem. I've got plenty of grain saved up. Even if the bull kills all the crops, nothing too bad's going to happen to Uruk. And she's the patron goddess of Uruk. You'll remember that Gilgamesh built that awesome temple for her. So the bull's released and Enkidu and Gilgamesh fight it. And the myth may be kind of like just showing the proper way to kill a bull. So Enkidu grabs it by the tail and Gilgamesh gets a big sharp knife and like kills it between the forehead. Cuts out the heart, he gives it to Shamash as an offering, and the thigh also gets cut off, or in this translation, it's the shoulder. And Enkidu literally just throws it at Ishtar and he's like, I wish I could kill you, Ishtar. And obviously she becomes very angry by that. So the gods take a council, and Anu believes that someone needs to be punished for the killing of the bull of heaven and the killing of Humbaba. And the gods decree that it's going to be Enkidu who gets killed, which he sees in a dream. And Enkidu is devastated. He curses the hunter that brought him into civilization. He curses Shamyat for her role in domesticating him. He even curses the shrine that he made to Enlil with the cedars that came from Lebanon. He's just upset in every way. And Shamash intervenes and he's like, hey, don't curse Shamhat because she's the reason you even know Gilgamesh. And so he takes it back and he blesses her instead. He weakens over a 2-week period and he dies in shame because he did not die in battle. And Gilgamesh sings this really beautiful lament about Enkidu, and that he was like the axe at his side, the strength of his hand, the sword at his belt, and now Enkidu is lost in the dark and can no longer hear him. And Gilgamesh just weeps and lies in vigil for 7 days and 7 nights until the body literally starts to rot. It is described as maggots start dripping from Enkidu's nose. So he builds a monument to his friend. They do the proper funeral rites. Here, I guess I would like to reference this Sumerian myth that is not in the official epic, that is about Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld. And it's Enkidu's depictions of Kur that I would like to kind of focus on, about how it's just a dreadful place, the underworld. It's dark. As I already said, like the food is clay. And he goes down there because Gilgamesh lost his axe. Because they were messing around, there's this big crack, and Gilgamesh drops his axe and it goes all the way to the underworld, and Enkidu goes to get it. And he doesn't act wisely, and he's held as a captive. So Gilgamesh asks Enlil to help him, but he won't. And then he asks Enki, who kind of gets Shamash involved, and Shamash, because he's the sun, brings up Enkidu's shade as he crosses the sky, because the sun has to descend into the west where dead things are, and then it rises in the east so it can bring new life. And so that's where Enkidu's shade comes back up. Shamash saves it with the new dawn. Enkidu tells Gilgamesh the conditions of the underworld, and the shades who are childless are going to be the ones who are suffering the most because nobody has any food to offer them and they don't have any water. And the shades who are missing any body parts, when you're buried, you're also going to be missing them in the afterlife. So that means that being buried whole is really necessary. And there's this belief that kind of persists, it prevails through all of Near Eastern culture, that the way you're buried really matters for how you're going to be treated in your afterlife. Gilgamesh is taking a really strong precaution here. He wants to bury Enkidu well and provide for him well so that his afterlife is good. Enkidu dying and like maggots on Enkidu, his rotting body, is I think what is the real trigger point for Gilgamesh's fear of death. It is what really sets him off. He's no longer just like young and reckless Gilgamesh who's willing to go fight battles and die really valiantly as long as he makes a great name for himself. Now he's really wanting true immortality, where he's not going to die at all. He doesn't want to go to the underworld. He decides that he is going to go and search for immortal life. And even though Enlil has decreed that he's not going to get immortal life, Gilgamesh is like, I'm going to do it. So he knows about this guy, Utnapishtim, and that he was granted everlasting life after the great flood. So Gilgamesh resolves that he's going to seek him out and try and find immortality. Utnapishtim is also known, as I said, as Atrahasis, and he is a wise king that is saved several times from Enlil's wish to destroy humanity. The Atrahasis myth is separated from the Epic of Gilgamesh, but it is integrated with the Babylonian epic. So Utnapishtim resides in the Garden of the Gods, which Gilgamesh will have to seek in order to learn his secret for immortality. And no mortal man has ever gone this way before. So that's kind of hearkening back to this idea of the epic. Gilgamesh must go out of the land of order into the land of chaos, confronting strange creatures and gods and trials in order to find what he is seeking in this myth. So first he's going to meet this scorpion man at this big pass, and the scorpion's man wife. And you might be thinking that Gilgamesh is going to have to do battle with them, but he's really not. They're just going to have this conversation, and the scorpion man sends him through, and either it's 12 leagues of complete darkness, and it may be 12 leagues no matter what, but either it's just Gilgamesh has to make it through this really long dark cave where there's no light, or he is racing the sun from one side to the other, and the way he gets through is by beating the sun. It is dependent on translation, and I'm not sure which one makes the most sense. But either way, he's, I guess, about 36 miles he needs to do in 12 hours. So he traverses it, he makes it through, and he does beat the sun, and then he meets with Shamash, who is the sun god, on the other side. And when he comes out the other side, he is at a garden at the edge of the world, which is an ocean. Shamash is going to dissuade Gilgamesh here. He's going to say, like, you're not going to get eternal life. This isn't the way life is supposed to go for you. And Gilgamesh is just ignoring the warning, and he continues on his quest. And he runs into this alewife, maybe goddess, named Siduri. And she's encouraging to Gilgamesh. She is like, accept death. It is the ultimate fate of all man. You should enjoy what wonders there are of life here while you still can. So she's saying, don't waste your youth. Enjoy life. There's so much good here. Don't spend it worrying about death. And Gilgamesh says, I am not going to listen to you. And so she says, okay, if you're really looking for Utnapishtim, then Shanabi, his boatman, is over here. And you can go talk to him, and he can take you to Utnapishtim. So Gilgamesh does that. He finds Shanabi, and they fight for some reason. That also is not particularly clear in the stone tablets. So they fight. He either destroys the tackle and the mast, depending on the translation, or these stone ones, who might be these kind of deathless oarsmen who are able to traverse the ocean without any difficulty. And the reason why one might want this is because Utnapishtim's island, Bahrain, is surrounded by the waters of death. So if Gilgamesh touches it, or if Shanabi touches them, they would die. But the stone things, because they're like a stone crew, maybe wouldn't die if they touched it, because they're stone and not alive. But either way, Gilgamesh destroys it. He cannot catch a ride from Shanabi to Utnapishtim. He's like, you've got to go get these long poles. We need 300 really long poles, and that's going to propel us forward, because we can't reuse the poles, because we can't risk the water of death getting on us. So Gilgamesh goes and he cuts the poles. And then the two set out, and they reach Utnapishtim, and Gilgamesh asks him for the secret of immortality. And Utnapishtim says, there's no permanent. Do we build a house to stand forever? Do we seal a contract to hold for all time? Do brothers divide an inheritance to keep forever? Does the flood time of the rivers endure? And Gilgamesh is like, okay, old man, here's the philosophy that you're giving, but you're still here. You've been here since the flood. So there's a secret that you got to tell me about how you're still here. And so Utnapishtim relents, and he says, okay, I'm going to tell you the secrets of the gods. And that's how we get to the flood myth. The flood myth of Mesopotamia. You may notice some similarities between the flood myth story here and the Hebrew story from Noah and the Ark. There are some really interesting parallels, and one can assume that the writer of Genesis was familiar with the flood stories of the ancient Near East. Traditionally, the writer of Genesis is Moses, who is raised as an Egyptian prince, according to Genesis. He would be a literate person who is familiar with Egyptian myth and also probably with a certain amount of Akkadian and Babylonian myth. That is a reasonable assumption. This can be disquieting to some people of faith and deconstructive for some. Did the author of Genesis just basically steal this myth and just try to repackage it for Jewish purposes? Or on the other hand, is this kind of just more of a universal mythology? Did it really happen? Is that why it keeps showing up everywhere? And then maybe kind of like a middle ground question would be, what are the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, the Hebrews trying to communicate about the world through this flood myth concept? That's the more interesting question to be asking. What is trying to be communicated about the world by including this flood myth? So you've got the Tigris and the Euphrates. They're flooding really regularly. They're very destructive. And if you've got a flood myth like that, if that's how your just general geography is, and you're associating the Tigris and the Euphrates with the moods of the gods, then it makes sense that you would say, okay, there was this huge flood and the gods caused it. And it's kind of the capricious nature of these gods that they just want to destroy humanity. They want to make life hard for us. That's why there was a giant flood. Whereas I think kind of in contrast with the Hebrew view, it is more that the Hebrew God Yahweh is so holy that he can't be with sin. And sin just continues to enter the world and gets worse and worse and worse. And so the only way to handle that is through a flood or a deluge of water that purifies the earth. So that one is kind of more of a story of a holy God enacting justice and cleansing his earth, as compared to a capricious God that is seeking to just get rid of humans because they're too noisy. And that is my little compare and contrast of the flood myth wise between Hebrew and Mesopotamian. And I'm not going to go into the whole flood story from the Bible, but let's get into the whole flood story from Mesopotamia. Utnapishtim lives in the Euphrates. He lives in an old city on the Euphrates, and the gods are also growing old. And Lil hears the clamor of the people, and he's like, hey, I'm not getting any sleep anymore, so this is a problem. The gods agree that they're going to exterminate mankind. In the original, Enlil is going to try several methods that include droughts and disease, but each time Ea or Enki tells the mortals about what's happening so they can kind of prepare for it. And Enlil just keeps getting frustrated. Eventually, they decide they're going to go with this flood option, and the gods make Enki swear that this time he's not going to tell any mortals about it. This is why he's going to kind of covertly tell Utnapishtim through dreams in the Gilgamesh version of this. Ea or Enki has an oath with Utnapishtim, and he's covertly warning him about the coming flood. Utnapishtim builds a boat, interestingly, without any hallmarks of a boat, and it's kind of just shaped like a floating ziggurat. It is a place of floating worship. It's 7 layers. It's just like a ziggurat. Utnapishtim does not warn any other people about the coming flood. He's just kind of leaving them to their fates to get drowned. Of the gods, once the deluge starts, they start to kind of regret what's happening. Ishtar very specifically mourns that they have allowed the people to get killed. Because if the humans are dying, that means the gods are starving. So the whole reason, and that's also explained in that original Atrahasis myth, the whole reason that man was created was for the purpose of serving the gods, to feed them, do all the labor, because before the gods had to do the labor, and who wants to do that? So they're like, we're going to create men, and men are going to do the labor, and men are going to worship us, and men are going to feed us, and then we don't have to do anything. But then they destroyed all the men. And they were like, oh no, we're not getting our sacrifices. We're wasting away. Blood's over, and Utnapishtim does a sacrifice. And the gods all swarm around it, and they're like, oh, thank goodness, food. And so, also, that is what summons Enlil. And he realizes that Enki has once again gotten one on him, and somebody survived. But the gods have decided that no, they don't want to kill all of humanity because they really would like those sacrifices. But they need to find some ways to prevent too many people from occupying the earth. And I think this is what's really interesting about the myth and why there is kind of a certain amount of debate about what they do. So the first part that gets agreed on is that 1/3 of all pregnancies are going to be miscarriages, and then 1/3 of children are not going to make it past childhood. And then this other part of it is that they decide that no longer will man be endless in days, kind of, is maybe the language that we're using. One way to look at it, because at the end of this, Enlil gives Utnapishtim, gives him immortality with his wife. But like another way maybe to look at it is that they always had immortality. So it's not that they're impervious. The gods aren't impervious either. They can be killed. It is that they are not going just to die of old age. But here, where the gods are kind of agreeing how they're going to limit humans so that they don't become too numerous, one of the things they maybe decide on is to take away their endless days, to put a cap on how long humans are going to live. Maybe this doesn't affect Utnapishtim and his wife the same way it does the rest of man, because he's the last human from the pre-flood days. But that part's like very debated, and it could be that he just gets immortality and that's that. And in the Gilgamesh myth, it's kind of more the council of gods give him more immortality, and they put him on the mouth of the Euphrates or in Bahrain or wherever they're putting him. And he's in the garden of the gods, and he's isolated from other men. And that's just going to be how he lives now. Utnapishtim asks Gilgamesh who's going to call an assembly of the gods for him. So who is going to make sure that Gilgamesh lives forever, because it's already been decreed by the gods that he's not. And he's just supposed to accept this. And Gilgamesh says, I don't want to accept this. So Utnapishtim says, all right, then stay awake for 7 days. And 7 is another one of those special numbers in Near Eastern culture. And this idea is that Gilgamesh has got to conquer the little cousin, the little brother to death, which is sleep. So sleep is like the small death. And so Gilgamesh is like, no problem, man, I'll stay awake, and immediately falls asleep. And his wife says, Utnapishtim's wife says, maybe you should wake Gilgamesh up. And he's like, no, he's gonna lie. He's gonna say he was just resting his eyes. So we need to make it really clear that he was asleep, and he was asleep for a long time. So he tells his wife every day to bake a loaf of bread and put it by Gilgamesh. So when Gilgamesh finally is awoken on the 7th day, there's 7, he really can't deny that there are like moldy, hard, stale breads all around him, and that he did not, in fact, stay awake for 7 days. He did the opposite of that. He slept for 7 days. He is pretty despairing of his position now, and he feels like he's failed. Utnapishtim is like, okay, you need to go home now, but I'm gonna give you some cool clothes. I'm gonna clean you up. You're gonna look better. You're not gonna be wearing these lion skins anymore, which is what he's been wearing through this whole Enkidu midlife crisis thing that he's been going through. And then Utnapishtim also tells him about some sort of coral plant that is in the ocean, that if he eats of it, will rejuvenate him and give him back his youth, which kind of maybe he's wasted wandering around looking for immortality. So Gilgamesh goes, he leaves, he gets the coral, and he's like, hooray, I have this great thing, I'm gonna take it back to my city, the old men are gonna eat of it, and then I will eat of it last, and won't that be great? We're all gonna be young again. And that's like a really nice thought. And I think this really shows a lot of growth in Gilgamesh's character, because initially you'll remember that he didn't want to just be a good person to his men, but now he is. He's wanting to give the old men first before himself the chance to relive their youth. Gilgamesh has really improved as a person. He's better now. He's doing good things. But, you know, as it would happen, they stop for the night, and he looks away, and a snake comes up, and the snake eats the coral, and it sheds its skin, and Gilgamesh has nothing to bring back home to Uruk except his story. And this is also kind of like a story of, why do snakes shed their skin? It's because they've eaten the special coral, and so they are constantly rejuvenated back to youth. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk. He doesn't have anything, but he engraves his whole tale apparently on a stone, which is what maybe we've been reading, and that's his epic. So at the very end, Gilgamesh dies, and Enlil reveals the meaning of Gilgamesh and Enkidu's dreams, that Gilgamesh was given the kingship, and that was his destiny, not everlasting life. And he wished for Gilgamesh not to be sad or grieved by his fate, but to appreciate the power that was given to him on this earth. And as a shade, Gilgamesh is going to be a judge of the dead and be something kind of close to a god in the underworld. He is deified later in Mesopotamia itself. So when Gilgamesh dies, offerings are given to the gods concerning his afterlife. Gilgamesh should be well provided for in the afterlife, and he will continue to be so for as long as his name is known, because his name is known to all of us here. We're talking about him right now, and that second death is the last time somebody mentions your name. So Gilgamesh, according to Mesopotamian myth, is still doing just fine in his afterlife. Any guesses on theme here? This epic is about the fear of death and the acceptance of human limitations. So, which with so much divine interaction in this epic, you would be thinking that Gilgamesh maybe would even be concerned about serving the gods in some sort of religious way. But he's not. Like, this is very little about Gilgamesh and gods. It's far more about Gilgamesh the man and humanity itself, and how humanity contends with mortality and eventual death. Because that is the fate of man, it is to die. One might argue that Gilgamesh does not overly fear death at the start of this epic, and he goes kind of to fight pretty unfazed. But once he meets with Humbaba, Gilgamesh expresses his first fears of death and is paralyzed by it. And then with the death of Enkidu, Gilgamesh is overcome with grief and really experiences a crisis of self, where he wants true immortality, not just a name that will endure. Before that, he was kind of like maybe content with great deeds being what he was known for, but after the death of his friends, Gilgamesh is like, I need to not die, thanks. He doesn't find eternal life. He meets with despair, confronted with his sure failures, but he eventually has a realization that immortality will come by leaving behind what is lasting. So that would be the strong walls of Uruk that are said in the prologue, the temple that he built, the things that will endure past him that benefit the community that he leaves behind. And in a way, that is kind of the human experience. That is the immortality that humans really get. It is the community and the lineage that we leave behind us. So Gilgamesh does not ever turn to a creator for comfort. So even though he has like Ninsun, his mother, who's a goddess, he has Shamash as his patron god, his father apparently is some sort of deity, he never turns to them for comfort about his fears. Instead, all he really worries about is his achievements and the respect of Uruk. But on the other hand here, Gilgamesh kind of had to die to achieve immortality, something even his mother understands. So before she sends Enkidu and Gilgamesh off to go fight Humbaba, she kind of prays before Shamash for them, and she says, eventually Gilgamesh shall govern the netherworld and be the chief of shades, and he will pass judgment and will render verdicts, and what he says will be as weighty as the words of Dumuzi, who is an underworld god. It's kind of an irony that this hero who failed to gain immortality in life will become a god through his death and be a death god. So there we have it. That is the Epic of Gilgamesh. I hope this explanation has put Sumer into a little bit more context for you, and I hope going over this epic maybe makes it a little easier to digest. I know that the language can be kind of hard to confront at first. I would describe this as an especially radical worldview of a man, because it's really like an individual trying to find his place in the universe in compared to gods. Gilgamesh is put on somewhat equal standing with the divine. At the very least, the king is on some semi-divine plane with the god, which is a really interesting view of how Near Eastern people would view their kings. So they're not totally human, they're semi-divine. And that's really gonna play for us well when we start talking about Egypt, which will be in a few weeks. Please join me next time on Hogwash History when we go into that. It'll be like 2 or 3 parts, I think. One's gonna be on Egyptian thought and mythology, and then one's gonna be the history of the Old Kingdom. And I might do an episode on mummies, maybe, probably, I think I am, or at least mummies and pathology. Ancient pathology. Those are both really interesting topics. I don't think that's really going to be in the scope of a normal world history course, but those are so cool when you're talking about ancient Egypt. So I think that's where we're going to touch on next for Hogwash History. I'll get on writing those and filming them. And until then, thank you so much for watching, and please like and subscribe if you would like to see more. Thank you. Bye.